Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our May-July 2024 weather outlook with Jeff Lindner, which is hosted by South Texas Cotton and Grain Association. Look forward to your report to see what the weather's going to be like as we're trying to get our crop started and going. So I'm going to turn it over to Jeff.
All right, thank you, sir. Appreciate y'all having me. We're gonna touch base on the late spring outlook here. So May and into the first part of June, and then I look at an early look at the hurricane season, which I am in all my time of doing this, probably the most concerned I have ever been for a hurricane season is this year. So we're gonna get into that and talk a little bit about that as we go forward. So this is the year to date rainfall. So we y'all done fairly well down in the coastal bend and Victoria and Matagorda Bay areas with rain this spring so far, late winter into early spring, and near average conditions down there in the Corpus area down into the valley. And so this is kind of what we talked about back in January. The further north and east, the better the chances of rain are going to be, and then back to the south and west, kind of the drier it's going to be. And it's not horribly dry, but especially in that hill country back down towards Del Rio area, where you're trying to get out of the drought we had last year, below average rainfall is not helping with that. And we still have very, very significant issues ongoing with water supply in the Highland Lakes chain up on the Colorado River around Austin. So Lake Travis, Lake Buchanan, only running about 37 to 40% of their normal capacity right now. That is a horrible place to be heading towards summer. And so fingers crossed, May, maybe even into the early summer, possibly an early tropical system can get some water in the right places up there in the middle upper Colorado Basin. Same thing going on down in the Corpus Christi area with some of the Choke Canyon, back out on the Rio Grande at Falcon. Very, very low water levels on these lakes. So while we've had rain and the moistures in the ground, it hasn't converted to a lot of runoff into the water supply and lake systems. And so we're kind of looking at a longer term hydrologic drought, which is affecting those aspects. So what I've done here is taking a look at kind of the drought monitor for the last uh, several months. So this is back in September when we had that flash horrible drought ongoing across portions of the area, and then we got into January, lots of improvement, rains throughout the winter, and then to now. And so there hasn't been a lot of improvement since January, kind of a little bit of degradation, if you will, with the normally dry conditions kind of coming back in the coastal Bend Corpus area. And then, of course, out west along the Rio Grande Plains up to Del Rio. And you kind of see that spot there north and west of Austin, San Antonio, where it's just that one spot that has really missed out on the winter rainfall. And we can't get out of the drought conditions in that area. Another thing to look at is what we call the KBDI values. And so this is the soil, how wet the soil is down to 8 inches. So everything you see in the blue as you're reaching wet conditions in those 0 to 2 inches. So it's saturated below that. So this is pretty much saturated conditions. And you can kind of see the haves and the have-nots here off to the north and the east, where we saw the rainfall surplus. The ground conditions are doing very well. But surely, coming up from the southwest, the Rio Grande Plains, even spreading down into the valley and parts of South Texas, you're getting down 4 or 5 inches before you're hitting some decent moisture. And so we've seen this kind of going in the drier direction here. Of course, that's not surprising. We're warming up, so we're getting more evaporation. The vegetation is coming out, so it's using more of the soil moisture for growing and all that type of stuff. And we've also seen a decent amount of wind, which helps dry out those top layers of soil, and not a whole lot of rain down in the South Texas Valley area. We've kind of had our rains in these kind of groups, if you will, or these kind of episodes where you'll get 1 or 2 inches and then it won't rain for 2 or 3 weeks, and then you'll get an inch or so and then it won't rain for 2 or 3 weeks. So it kind of comes all at once. And that's kind of how the winter has been. Fire weather, really no surprise. Kind of the western part of the state continues to be at risk. Kind of a lot of that panhandle stuff is just the green up, finally getting up there to get rid of the frozen grasses and green it up. So that reduces the fire weather risk. Down in South Texas, I haven't heard of any fire down there. It was I was down there not too long ago. It was fairly green. So I'm kind of surprised with the burn bans, but the winds are another thing down there. Those south winds, 25, 30, 40 miles an hour. And if something got going, it could get out of control. But for the most part, we've had kind of some precipitation to keep the fire weather in check. All right, so let's talk about El Nino and La Nina. Something that's a big player. It's interesting that we had a really strong El Nino in place. So this is back in September of last year. You can see all that red water, that above average water there off the coast of South America, down to south of Hawaii. But we really never got a good El Nino response in the Southern Plains in Texas this year. And we'll have to, somebody smarter than me will have to go back and try to figure out why exactly that is. We haven't had significantly above average rainfall. We did not have any significant flooding. And so, you would kind of expect with the connections with El Nino that we would have above average rainfall in Texas and the Southern Plains. You kind of saw that graph where it was more a little bit off to the north and the east. And so this is how water temperatures have been going. You can see in September, very warm. January, kind of near the peak of it, very warm. And this is April. And you can see the first thing that shows up is we've seen a decrease in the sea surface temperatures in the eastern Central Pacific. And you can see that really cold water starting to show up there off the coast of South America. And this El Nino is in a pretty rapid decline. If you remember back about a year ago, we were in a very rapid incline or development into El Nino. And now we're in a very rapid decline. And it's very likely that we're going to see this El Nino completely collapse here over the next month or two. So as we get into May and June, that could have some impact with us on the summer. I don't think it's going to have a huge impact with respect to the local weather here this summer. Obviously, as we get into next fall and winter, this probably supports a drier, warmer type regime. But I do think this is going to have potentially very big impact on our hurricane season. We'll talk some more about that. Okay, so you can kind of see the declining here sea surface temperatures in all the Nino regions. That 1 and 2 down at the bottom is right off the coast of South America. You can see it's going negative. Again, to get to La Nina, you want to see all three of these regions, specifically that 3.4 region, get down to about a negative 0.5. So it's going in that direction, and there's not a lot of deep water out there. So this is probably going to happen relatively quickly. And that's what this is showing. This is showing a very rapid decay of the El Nino we have. And by the time we get to July, August, September, October, nearly all of the statistical and dynamical models here are showing a La Nina condition. Some of them getting pretty into the strong category, negative 1.5 sea surface cooling out in the Central Eastern Pacific. And so this is certainly something we're going to keep an eye on. I think sometimes these models are a little aggressive, but just based on the cooling we're seeing and the fact that there's not a lot of deep warm water out there, they're probably on the right track here. And we'll probably be down into La Nina conditions by at least late June, maybe into July. And again, I think this is going to have a potential really big impact on our hurricane season. So we'll go through the charts that we typically look at. So these are the precipitation anomalies. This is all for May, June, July. This is the American CFSV2. Can y'all hear me? I guess y'all can. I was muted. I think y'all can hear me now. So you can go through here and you can see the dryness that this model is portraying down along the coast. This is really the only guidance that is showing this. This is the European. It has a wetter signal that you're seeing down in the Southern Plains in Texas. I wouldn't say it's overly wet, but it does have a wetter signal down in that area. And then this is the Canadian, again, kind of a wetter-ish signal down along the coast or near normal. And the multi-model, this is all of them put together, and it kind of has that wettish signal, if you will, down along the coast. And so, I think going into May and June, we're gonna, if I had to give a forecast for South Texas coastal bit, I think you're gonna see about near normal precipitation, maybe a little bit below normal as you get back along the Rio Grande Plains and stuff like that. I really think the Gulf is going to be an influence as we start getting into late May and June. The sea breeze looks more active this year. We don't really see a pattern that looks like high pressure sitting up over Texas and this ridiculous heat like we had last year. It looks more like subtropical ridging, a normal summer where we get the afternoon showers and thunderstorms that start on the coast in the morning and kind of move inland, um, with a relatively kind of active, if you will, Gulf of Mexico. And so I think this is, if there's ever anything close to normal, this is shaping up to be somewhat of a normalish early summer pattern. Um, can we get some heavier rains in May with some frontal system? Yes, that is on the table. There's some indications that May could be a little bit active, but it's interesting that the fronts and all that are starting to lift a little bit further north, and not make it quite down this far south. But we could get a stalled front down here still in the right conditions in May that could produce some heavy rains. And that's the other thing. We're in that time of year now where it can really rain. If it decides it wants to rain, it can, we can get several inches of rain in a short period of time, a foot of rain. How helpful that is for a lot of things, is kind of a short term thing because a lot of it runs off. But as we look at going long term here into the summer, I don't right now see anything suggesting big heat, big high pressure in Texas, but more of a kind of a normal summer pattern. High pressure looks like it may want to sit up out here over the Four Corners area, New Mexico, back down into the northern parts of the deserts of Mexico, is possible this summer, and that's kind of twofold. One is it brings below normal precipitation out in that area, but we also do not this summer, for the most part, look like we're going to have this protective high pressure ridge on us, which also helps to keep the tropical storms and hurricanes away. And so that is also something we'll take a look at. But this is kind of the national outlook. I think they're a little bit aggressive, with that below average area out there in West Texas. That may be a little bit smaller. But really, there's no big signal here, and you kind of saw that in the maps. If anything, it's kind of a normal, maybe slightly wetter leaning, forecast here going into the early summer part. As far as the temperatures go, you can see these are the temperatures. No surprise here. We continue to go through this practically every time we do this. It's just warm, above average temperatures, through the period. Interestingly enough, the European, is not significantly above average in Texas. This may be a function of a little bit more of the showers and thunderstorms, especially central North Texas into the plains in May. You get that active severe weather type pattern and setup, and so that could be what's being shown here. But again, this is not a big high pressure ridge sitting over Texas type look, in any of this. It's certainly not on the Canadian, kind of near normal conditions, which means in the summertime, you're probably getting some type of precipitation. And then you kind of zero it all out and with the mean here, the average, and you kind of see that, yeah, we're going to probably be above normal, but not significantly above normal. One thing I will say, I think this year, last year we started a lot with really high temperatures. So hundreds, 100 plus in the afternoons early, like in June. I don't see that this year. Overnight low temperatures are still probably going to be a struggle for us. That was something we dealt with last year a lot, lows in the 80s, the low 80s, even the mid 80s, down along the coast at night. And that was a function of how warm the Gulf of Mexico is. And I see that happening again this year. The Gulf is warm. And when the Gulf is warm, you get these really high dew points, into the area. you just can't cool down at night. So, low temperatures between 78 even inland, and 81, 82, 83, 84, 85 along the coast is certainly possible as we go into June. Um, and that also tends to yield some very impressive heat index values in the afternoon. So even if we have near normal heat, 92, 93, 94, 95 in the afternoon, and it's really humid, you can still get those heat index values up into the one teens and stuff like that. So I still think that's on the table, even though high temperatures themselves will probably be a little bit closer to normal than what we saw last June. And so this is a seasonal outlook, generally speaking, above normal temperatures. As far as drought goes, you can see we're continuing to hopefully remove some of that drought there in Central Texas and the Hill Country. That if that's going to happen, it'll happen in one or two ways. One, here in the month of May, when we get some thunderstorms on the dry line, or something that happens up, in the month of May with a front in that area. The only other way after that is if we get something early season in the tropics that comes in, and a well-defined tropical wave, a tropical depression, or tropical storm that comes into the valley or the coastal bend and kind of moves up through the hill country and helps alleviate that drought in that area. Generally, drought persists out there across the Rio Grande, and maybe some development along the Rio Grande, but we're not expecting significant expansion of drought into Texas. So it's mainly just the western and southwestern part of the state. So the overall outlook is kind of like what we talked about. Near normal rainfall, maybe slightly above. If you're up in that Victoria, Matagorda Bay area, I think you'll probably be closer to above than areas out along the Rio Grande, above normal temperatures and near average soil moisture. So, a relatively normal looking aspect to the late spring and early summer. All right, so now let's take a look at what we've all been waiting for, the 2024 hurricane season. So, last year was a relatively active year, but most of the storms last year stayed out in the Atlantic. And so there's no big name storms that we had last year that folks remember. This year's looking significantly different. And like I said early, of all the years I've done this, I've never been as concerned as I am this year for the Gulf of Mexico and simply put, for the Texas coast. And I'll go into why I'm saying that. So the first thing we look at is sea surface temperatures. This is April, and look at the sea surface temperature anomalies in the Atlantic. The Atlantic is hot. It has been hot for the last couple of years. These sea surface temperatures that we see right now in the Atlantic equal about July. So we are already way above the curve on sea surface temperatures. And there's a very strong correlation with warm sea surface temperatures in the Atlantic and a very active tropical storm and hurricane season in the Atlantic basin. And it's not just the warm sea surface temperatures, but it's also the look of those sea surface temperatures. And if you kind of look at the Atlantic basin here, you can kind of see it has this look that comes off of the northwest coast of Africa and Spain, and then down to the southwest toward the Caribbean and through the Caribbean, and a little bit of maybe cooler water up here around Bermuda and the north central Atlantic. That is a very favorable look for sea surface temperature look for an active hurricane season, because that difference in the very warm waters to the south and slightly cooler waters to the north help create instability. And so it makes the atmosphere a little bit more unstable and more favorable for thunderstorms to develop. And so it's not just the Atlantic's hot, it's where the Atlantic is hot. And it's hot, unfortunately, in kind of the wrong places this year for a quiet season. If you want a kind of a quiet season, you'd either have you'd have above normal temperatures everywhere, or like we've seen in some of the past years, above normal temperatures up here off the northeast United States coast. And we don't really see that this year. So if you're looking for an active hurricane season, this is what you're definitely looking for in the Atlantic basin for sea surface temperatures. And then we'll talk about the rainfall, and this is probably some of the more concerning stuff. So all of these maps are for August, September, October. That's kind of the heart of our hurricane season. And you can see right off the bat here's the European, and it's showing a very wet northwestern Caribbean, some wetness into the Gulf of Mexico, and the stretching all the way back to the coast of Africa. This is really opposite of what we saw last year, which was really dryness in the Western Caribbean up into the Gulf of Mexico. It was wet, kind of out off the coast of Africa. A lot of those storms stayed out to sea. We were pretty confident last year with La Nina and what the models were showing that the Caribbean was going to be closed off. And that's really exactly what happened. We had very few storms in the Caribbean. We had very few storms in the Gulf of Mexico. Almost everything was out in the Atlantic. Very typical of La Nina. El Nino is almost the opposite. It really favors, I'm sorry, last year was El Nino, this year's La Nina. And La Nina is the opposite. It really favors Western Caribbean, Gulf of Mexico activity. Lots of storms potentially west of 60, which if you get storms west of 60 west, the chances of them impacting somebody really go up. And so that is what's, the concerning thing. You say, well, this is the European. Well, what does everything else look like? Well, here's the Canadian. Again, a very strong wet signal here in the Caribbean, up into the Gulf of Mexico, extending back west to the coast of Africa. This again, very concerning that it's the Western Caribbean into the Gulf of Mexico. Almost all storms that form in that area are going to hit somewhere. And if they're pulled up into the Gulf of Mexico, it really puts the U.S. Gulf Coast at risk. This is somewhat similar to the setup we had back in 2020. And if we remember after 2020, A, we're at the height of COVID, but B, we had multiple big hurricane landfalls on the U.S. Gulf Coast. Louisiana, that's the year Louisiana had 6 named storms hit, 4 hurricanes into the state in one season, Laura, Delta, and some of the other ones. And so, this pattern is somewhat sitting up similar to that. This is the American model. Not as impressive. It shows a little bit more of the African kind of waves, maybe going a little bit further north of the Caribbean, but it also still has this wet signal there in the Western and Central Caribbean up into the Gulf of Mexico. This model is tending to be an outlier. It's the same model that's showing those drier conditions there in the coastal plains of Texas. And so, I think that this model may be struggling a little bit. It's kind of an outlier from the rest of the guidance. And then here's the average. You put them all together, and the average here is very wet through the Caribbean, the Southern Gulf, the whole Gulf, if you will, and then kind of out across the coast of Africa. And so, the setup and the pattern, when you put it all together, we're going towards La Nina. La Nina favors tropical storm and hurricane development in the Atlantic. It cuts down on the wind shear, which prevents tropical storms and hurricanes from forming, especially in the Caribbean, the southern Gulf of Mexico, the Bay of Campeche. That is really where the El Nino, La Nina plays its biggest factor. So, it's not so much off the coast of Africa and out the Atlantic as we saw last year. It's closer into home where we have to be watching and concerned. And so these are the numbers. The numbers coming out are big. Right off the bat, this is from Colorado State, 23 named storms, which means we'd go straight into our second auxiliary list. We have 21 storms on our list. We've only done that twice, 2005 and 2020. And so based on this, we would go into the backup list of names this year. Normal is 14. So we're almost looking at 2 hurricane seasons worth of storms in 1 year. Hurricanes 11, average is 7. Major hurricanes as a category 3 or higher, 5, average is 3. And the folks at Colorado State really struggled to find analog years that really match what's happening. The quick demise of El Nino to La Nina, but also this extraordinarily warm Atlantic water temperatures. And going back and looking, it was very difficult to find anything that resembled an Atlantic that is as warm as it is right now. And so these were the years they came up with, going, digging way back, and who knows how good the stuff is back in the 1920s and 1870s, both with storms and tracks and also with water temperatures. There's almost really not a lot of good data back in that time for sea surface temperatures. So I don't know how much stock I put in those early ones there, but this is the closest that they came up with to years that resemble what it looks like for this summer. And you can see 98, we did have 2 tropical storms in Texas, Charlie that came into Rockport. This is also the same Charley that produced the devastating, catastrophic flooding out in the Del Rio area. Tropical Storm Francis that came into Port Aransas that produced the big flooding in the Houston area, but it also produced a prolonged storm surge event on the upper Texas coast. So Francis was very slow moving and went through several tide cycles. And for 2 or 3 days, it allowed the tides to pile up. We actually got about 8 feet of storm surge on the Bolivar, west end of Galveston Island, Galveston Bay area from Francis, which resulted in a tremendous amount of beach erosion. So Francis, even though it was a tropical storm, made landfall way down the coast, had huge impacts on the upper coast. Of course, '05, y'all remember '05, very busy year. That's the Katrina Rita year, and we did have Rita go in just east of us. I included them, the storm that went in just east of us there at Holly Beach. 2010 Tropical Storm Hermine. This came up in the Rio Grande from the south and kind of moved straight up between San Antonio and Austin, produced flooding rainfall in the hill country. I think that was in September. And then 2020 matches also very well. So we had Hurricane Hannah down in the South Texas area, Port Mansfield, and Tropical Storm Beta later in the year, toward the end of September in Matagorda. And so two things stand out. It's certainly the analog years are, have activity here on the Texas coast. And B, if you look at kind of some of this stuff, Rita and Beta and Hermine were kind of later season storms. So we're talking late September even. So this could be a year where we go on into September with threats, possibly even into early October. La Nina tends to favor later season. So we can drag it out a little bit here in the Western Gulf. Typically, our season kind of shuts down pretty quick around the 1st of October. With threats here in the Western Gulf. But this year we saw in 2020 with Hurricane Delta, the first week of October, that we could get some threats here in the Western Gulf even late into the season. And I would not discount an early season threat in June coming out of the Gulf, a depression or a tropical storm that kind of comes up from the south and or southeast and comes into Texas. I wouldn't discount that at all. So this is looking back at just sea surface temperatures. It doesn't take into account El Nino, La Nina, anything like that. But this is sea surface temperature anomalies from 1979 to 2014, and all of the years that match close to the sea surface temperatures we currently have. And again, this is as close as we get, but the Atlantic is much warmer than anything we've seen even in these previous analog years. And you can see some big years stand out there, 98, 2005 stand out. And you can see kind of exactly what the dynamical models are showing with respect to the wetness area is hinted at there in the Western Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. So this has absolutely no forecasting ability at all. So this doesn't take into anything with thunderstorms or sea surface pressures or El Nino, La Nina, or anything like that. This is just when based on the current sea surface temperature anomalies, where we've seen storms in the past. And what is very kind of scary, if you will, is that this matches up very close to our dynamic models. So, where we're seeing those big green rainfall anomalies we're also seeing in the past with these types of sea surface temperatures, that's where the hurricanes have tracked. And you can see that they're off the Yucatan into the Western Gulf. Texas, the Gulf Coast has certainly been at risk with this type of setup with sea surface temperatures. So that's pretty concerning. And then I put this in here, I've looked at this before. I'm not overly on board with this. This is the European, and it kind of tries, if you will, to give an area where it's expecting enhanced tropical activity. And so this is May through October. So this would be for roughly our entire hurricane season. And what's interesting is in March when this product came out, it had very little enhancement anywhere in the Atlantic basin. And then when the April run came out, you see that it's kind of highlighting the Gulf of Mexico, both the Western and the Eastern Gulf, and then kind of, maybe up the Eastern seaboard. And it's also starting to show some values there in the tropical Atlantic. And so This is a little worrying for me because the trend is again starting to key in on that Gulf of Mexico of being a very favored, enhanced area of not only risk of tropical storms and hurricanes developing in the Gulf, but potentially moving into the Gulf from the Western Caribbean or even out from the Atlantic this year. And so I really do think it's going to be a very busy season. I think the state of Texas has a risk of not only tropical storm and hurricane, but potentially multiple threats. So this could be a season where we get something in June or July, and we potentially get bigger threats in August and September. How bad where it hits is anyone's guess, but I definitely, if this was ever a time to make sure you had everything in order, insurance and plans and preparations, this is the year for that. And so this is just kind of, this is from Colorado State, so it's the best stab, if you will, kind of in the dark of where some of these things may go. We have no clue where a hurricane or is going to go in August or September, but just based on the analog years and the number of storms and all that, they can sort of put some statistics with the threat here, and you can see everything on the left. So is the 2024 forecast. So for Texas, we have an 80% chance of a tropical storm landfall in the state of Texas in 2024. Average is about 61%. So we're running, well above average on the threat for a tropical storm landfall. A hurricane percentage for this year is 54%. Again, this is for the whole Texas coast, which is relatively big. Average is 36%, and the major hurricane that's a category 3 or higher, we have a 25% risk, and average is 16%. And so you can see it's not just Texas. Look at Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. Mississippi, Alabama, relatively small coastlines, but look at their risk level. And then, of course, Florida. Florida every year has a high risk. Their average on a tropical storm is near 90% every year. And if you're a betting person, you have almost 100% chance of a tropical storm somewhere in Florida this hurricane season. And look at that major hurricane percentage: 44% chance of a major hurricane strike in the state of Florida this year. That's almost half. So very concerning for the Gulf Coast. And even here for Texas for this hurricane season. So I'll leave it at that. Here's the time for questions, and if y'all want to be added to the email list, there's the email address there that we can get you added onto that. But I'll open it up to questions. I know there's probably some there, especially with that hurricane season, that lovely forecast there.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm going to stop recording and open it up for questions.